we're going to address another region of the muscular system. It's important that we know the rules that we are going to learn with, and one of the best rules is that don't study hard, study smart. What is this? These are 5 question marks. Why am I presenting to you this idea? Because one of the very successful industrious man said, when you ask yourself 5 questions about any problem, you will solve your problem. I always need to remind myself and you that anatomy is a visual and descriptive science. What does that mean? And what should I do? Here is what should I do. I always put an image in front of me and have a very good look at it, and then write down my notes on that image, describing it. How are muscles arranged? They are arranged in groups. That's how we study. We ask ourselves questions and we try to answer them. What do? They move joints. Only joints? No, they can move other structures as well. What kind of movement do muscles have? They are usually having the power of pulling. Do they have the action of pushing? The answer is no. What are the types of actions of muscles? Usually muscles have a main action. Do they have something else? The answer is yes. They may have a minor action. Let us ask questions about the muscles. Always remember that muscle action is what? Muscle action is a force. What kind of force? The force that has directions. Is there any force that doesn't have directions? The answer is no. These directions can be 1 or 2 or 3. When we say muscles work as a group, the group must coordinate each other. Coordination between a group of people forms a team. This team is going to move joints. Now, what do we need to understand the muscular system? That's a good question. The answer is we need good knowledge of synovial joints, the movable joints. Plus, what kind of movements do synovial joints have? What are these people doing? They are sitting around a round table and they are discussing something. Now, knowledge without discussion is not really up to what is needed. Therefore, it is a very good advice that you should not miss collecting information. You discuss this information and you analyze it, and then you share it. When you share, you discover what kind of information you have. Is it right or wrong? Now, let us discuss some group of muscles. Here is an image of muscles of head and neck. Now, we need to ask ourselves questions. What is this muscle which is coming from the sternum, the manubrium of the sternum, the medial 1/3 of the clavicle, and it goes up and obliquely towards the mastoid process. These are the data about this muscle. Let us see what is this image telling us. We ask ourselves questions. This is the muscle that we have just described. It is the sternomastoid, coming from the lower end manubrium sterni clavicle and going towards the mastoid process. Why should we take care and study this muscle? Because it is an important landmark in the neck. It separates the posterior triangle of the neck from the anterior triangle of the neck. Let us have a closer look at the lower end of the sternomastoid. Here we have what? It is the manubrium sterni, the upper part of the sternum. And here are the two origins of the two sternomastoid muscles, one on the right and one on the left, and they give what is called the sternal origin. And then we have this oval shape. What is this? This is shape is indicating that the other part of the sternomastoid is coming from the medial 1/3 of the clavicle, sending up what is called the clavicular head. Here is what is happening on the right side, and this is the clavicle. Here it is called what? It is called the collarbone, sending another part of the sternomastoid, and these two parts will join together. Let us ask ourselves a few questions about this image. It is a lateral view of the skull, and question number one is, what is happening inside this oval shape? The answer is that the sternomastoid is attached to the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Is that the only attachment? The answer is no. If it's no, where is it extending to then? It is extending to the superior knuckle line. What are the questions that we can ask ourselves about this image? We can see that when one side of the sternomastoid is contracting, now the ear is trying to approach the tip of the shoulder. So this is the action of the right sternomastoid. And when the ear try to point out the right shoulder, what happens to the chin? It points to the other side. This muscle is called sternocleidomastoid. Sterno for the sternum, cleido for the clavicle, and mastoid for the upper attachment of the muscle. It is also called sternomastoid, but people usually use the easier name sternomastoid. Remember, if you want to solve any problem, ask 5 questions and you will understand this subject. So it's a matter of questions and answers. We have seen the sternal head, which comes from what? From the anterior surface of the manubrium. What's the manubrium? It is the top part of the sternum. And we have seen the clavicular head coming from where? The medial 1/3 of the clavicle. And the muscle is going up to where? To the mastoid process, plus lateral 1/2 of what? Of the superior knuckle line of the occipital bone. Now, what does it do? It brings the mastoid process down towards the tip of the shoulder, and the chin is going to point to the other side. When both sternomastoid muscles act together, they flex the neck. The question is, what is this area? It is a lateral view of the skull and sitting on the cervical part of the vertebral column, and lower down we can see the thoracic inlet, the upper few ribs, and we can see 3 muscles. This is the first one. It is anterior, and this group of 3 muscles is called the scalene group of muscles. So this one is scalenus anterior. Then a little bit posterior to it is called scalenus medius, and the last one, the posterior one, is called scalenus posterior. The question is, where is this area? You can see in the upper part it's the mandible, then the pink vertebrae are the cervical vertebrae, and we can see the scalene group of muscles. So let's ask few questions and try to answer them. What is the structure inside this oval shape? The answer is, these are 4 points of the starting point of scalenus anterior. The starting points are on transverse process of upper 4 cervical vertebrae. Then this is going to form scalenus anterior, and it is going to be attached lower down on the first rib that has special tubercle for this muscle called scalene tubercle. And then a little bit posterior to it we have scalenus medius, which is also attached to the first rib, a little bit posterior to the anterior one. And then the scalenus posterior is not attached to the first rib, it is attached to the second rib. Let's ask few questions and try to answer them. What is this muscle? This is the anterior scalene. And what is this just posterior to it? It is the middle scalene. Both of them are attached to the first rib. And what is this? This is the first rib holding the anterior and middle scalene muscle. Now we know where we are, what is the region. So let's ask few questions and try to answer them. Which muscle is this? This is the posterior scalene. It is arising from lower cervical vertebrae. It is posterior to the first two, and it is inserted into the second rib. What questions can we ask ourselves about this image? It is clearly telling us that this muscle on the right, a group of these scalene muscles, when they contract, they flex the head towards the area of contraction. Let us write few basic facts about the scalene anterior by asking ourselves few questions and trying to answer them. Why do we study the scalene anterior muscle? Because it is an important landmark of the neck. What does it do? It elevates the first rib and laterally flexes the neck. From where does this scalene anterior muscle come from? It comes from lateral part of 4 cervical vertebrae. That means it comes from transverse processes of C3, C4, C5 and C6. Scalene anterior is going to be attached to the special tubercle on the first rib, and it is supplied by C5 to C7. Now, because it is attached to the first rib, it elevates the first rib. When the neck is fixed, therefore it is a muscle of respiration. Now it's the turn of some facts about scalenus medius. Ask questions and try to answer them. What does it do? It elevates the first rib and laterally flexes the neck. When it is attached to the first rib, that means it elevates it when the neck is standing in a position. Now, therefore, this is a muscle of respiration, and it is the inspiratory phase of respiration. From where scalenus and medius begin. They begin from posterior tubercles of C2, C3, C4 and C7, while the anterior one started from anterior tubercles, and it ends up on the upper surface of the first rib, and it is supplied by brachial plexus of nerves C3, C4, C5, C6, C7 and C8. Let us collect data about the scalenus posterior by asking ourselves questions and answering them. It elevates the second rib, not the first rib as the other two do, and it also flexes the neck laterally. When it is attached to the second rib, it is a muscle of respiration, the inspiratory phase, when the neck is fixed, and it goes down to the lateral surface of the second rib, not like the other two on the first rib, and it comes from posterior tubercles of transverse processes of C5, 6 and 7, and it is supplied by brachial plexus C7 and C8 spinal nerves. Do you know which muscle is this? Going from the cervical spines down to the first rib. This is scalenus anterior, and this one is scalenus medius. Both of them are attached to the first rib, and this is scalenus posterior attached to the second rib. Now we know which area is this. This is a lateral view of the neck, and we can see that it is a side view, and we can see lower down the scapula. The muscle colored green is coming from the cervical spines, and it comes down and attaches to where? It attaches to the medial part of upper border of the scapula. So it is easy to conclude that when this muscle contracts, it elevates the scapula. Therefore it is called levator scapulae. Let us ask ourselves few questions about this view. What is it? It's a posterior view of the skull, cervical vertebrae and upper part of the thorax, and we can see that there is a muscle taking origin from transverse processes of cervical spines, coming down and attaches to the medial border of the superior border of the scapula. Let us ask ourselves few questions and try to answer them about this image. For example, it is showing that there is a muscle arising from transverse processes of upper cervical vertebrae. Now, in this image, which is zooming in, and we can see that there are 4 slips coming out of transverse processes of cervical vertebrae. If we look at this image and ask ourselves, where is this muscle going to? It is going down to the lateral part of the superior border of the scapula, and here is a closer look at its attachment to medial part of the superior border of the scapula, and here is an image of the muscle. Therefore, this muscle is called levator scapulae. Now, let us organize some basic information about levator scapulae by asking ourselves few questions and try to answer them. It elevates the scapula, and it comes from transverse processes of C1, 2, 3, and 4 of the cervical spines, and it goes to the medial border of the scapula on the from the superior angle to the spine, and it is supplied by dorsal scapular nerve C5. Where are we now? We can see that this is the hyoid bone and this is the mandible. There is a group of muscles called suprahyoid muscles. The first one that makes the floor of the mouth is called mylohyoid muscle. Then there is another muscle which has a very strange shape called digastric. It has 2 bellies and a central tendon. This is the posterior belly, and this is another muscle that comes from the styloid process and attaches to the hyoid bone. Therefore it is called stylohyoid, and this is the hook that the stylohyoid makes. The stylohyoid, as it comes and attaches to the hyoid bone, it bifurcates and leaves a space in between the 2 limbs where the digastric muscle passes through and sends its anterior part or anterior belly to the mandible, most anterior part, where there is a fossa which is called digastric fossa. Here is another view of suprahyoid muscle. Let's look first at the stylohyoid muscle. It comes from the styloid process at the base of the petrous part of the temporal bone and comes down and medially and attaches to the hyoid bone, and this attachment is in the form of bifurcation. Alright, now we need to write down and organize some basic information about the stylohyoid muscle by asking ourselves a few questions. What does it do? It elevates and it drags the hyoid bone because it comes from higher up and attaches to the hyoid bone. And posterior part of styloid process that gives attachment to this muscle, when it comes to the hyoid bone, it splits so that the intermediate tendon of the digastric muscle is going to pass through, and it is supplied by facial nerve. Again, we are in the suprahyoid region studying another suprahyoid muscle. Now it is the digastric roll. The digastric roll is described as it comes from the mastoid process on the inside, and the first or the posterior belly comes anteriorly and down, and approaching the hyoid bone, it passes through the hook made by the insertion of the stylohyoid that tether it to the hyoid bone, and then it proceeds anteriorly as anterior belly and inserts into a little fossa off the line of the middle of the mandible, a fossa called digastric fossa. Now we need to organize some basic knowledge of the digastric muscle by asking ourselves a few questions. What does it do? It elevates the hyoid bone, and at the same time it depresses the mandible. There is an anterior belly which attaches to digastric fossa in the middle part of the mandible, and a posterior belly attaches to the mastoid notch of the temporal bone. The body of the hyoid bone, via a fibrous loop over the intermediate tendon. This loop is made by the insertion of the stylohyoid muscle. Now, this muscle has two bellies. The anterior belly is supplied by mylohyoid nerve coming from the trigeminal nerve, and the posterior belly is supplied by the facial nerve, a muscle that has two bellies and double nerve supply. Again, we are in the suprahyoid region studying another suprahyoid muscle. This muscle is attached to the body of hyoid bone, and it attaches also to the inner surface of the mandible, and the two muscles meet in the middle by a white fibrous structure called a raphe. This muscle is called mylohyoid muscle. Let us ask a few questions about this muscle. What does it do? It elevates the hyoid bone and the tongue and depresses the mandible. It attaches on the inside of the mandible into a line called mylohyoid line, and the right and the left one, they meet in the middle, called the middle line raphe, and then the raphe attaches to the body of the hyoid bone, and it is supplied by mandibular division of trigeminal, and it makes the floor of the mouth. Let us combine the two muscles, the digastric and the stylohyoid muscle, in one picture by asking ourselves a few questions. This structure is hyoid bone, and this is the styloid process, and the muscle comes from the styloid process and attaches to the hyoid bone by bifurcating tendon. This is the stylohyoid. Then at this point there is a muscle that takes attachment to the mastoid process, and as it comes down it reaches the point of bifurcation of the stylohyoid, and then it proceeds as anterior belly to the digastric fossa on the mandible. Where are we now? We ask ourselves a few questions. What is this? This is manubrium sterni, the upper part of the sternum, and this is the hyoid bone. So this is the region that is called infrahyoid region, and it has muscles called infrahyoid muscles. There is this muscle that comes from the posterior surface of manubrium sterni and attaches up to the body of the hyoid bone. Therefore it is called sternohyoid muscle. If the sternohyoid muscle is removed, we see another muscle deep to it, which comes also from the posterior surface of manubrium sterni and attaches to the thyroid cartilage on the outside, and this is called sternothyroid. And then there is another muscle from the outer surface of the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone, and this muscle is called thyrohyoid muscle. These are few facts about the sternohyoid, the muscle that extends from the manubrium sternum to the hyoid bone, and when it contracts it depresses and at the same time stabilizes the hyoid bone, and it covers the sternothyroid and thyrohyoid muscles, and the posterior surfaces of both manubrium and sternum ends of the clavicle and reaches the lower border of the hyoid bone medial to another muscle insertion, and it is supplied by a structure called ansa cervicalis. The thyrohyoid muscle is the muscle that is deep to the sternohyoid and extends from thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone. Let us ask ourselves a few questions. What is its position to the sternohyoid? It is deep to it. What does it do? It elevates the larynx, depresses and stabilizes the hyoid bone, and it comes from the oblique line on the outer surface of the thyroid cartilage and goes up to the lower border of the hyoid. We have studied a muscle that has two bellies and central tendon, and here is another example. This is the infrahyoid area containing infrahyoid muscle, and this is what? This is the hyoid bone, and this is sternohyoid muscle. Just lateral to it is another muscle, as we can see that this muscle is having now a fleshy part, and then in the middle changes to a tendon called intermediate tendon, and then it continues as fleshy part, the inferior part, and attaches to the scapula, upper border, just medial to the scapular notch. This muscle is called omohyoid. Omo means the scapula. Let us organize some basic information about the omohyoid we have just seen by asking ourselves a few questions. What does it do? When the scapula is fixed, it depresses and at the same time stabilizes the hyoid bone. There is an inferior belly and a superior belly. The inferior belly attaches to the upper border of the scapula, just medial to the scapular notch, and as it goes up and becomes superior belly after the intermediate tendon. Then the intermediate tendon of omohyoid is tethered to the clavicle by a fascial sling. There is no muscle splitting here. It is attached by a fascia to the clavicle. Now, the inferior belly leads to intermediate tendon. Superior belly, it's going to approach the lower border of the hyoid bone, just lateral to the sternohyoid muscle we have just seen. This is a nice image of the muscles of the neck and upper part of the chest, and let us test our knowledge by asking ourselves a few questions. Which muscle is this? This muscle is running obliquely in the neck from anterior to posterior, and this is the sternomastoid. Which muscle is this? This muscle is making the bridge between the neck and the shoulder, and this is the trapezius muscle. What is this muscle? I think nobody is going to miss that this is the deltoid muscle. Which muscle is this? This is quite obvious that this is pectoralis major, because it is occupying the pectoral area. Now, what is this muscle? This muscle, as we can see, it is on the side of the midline, and the fibers are perpendicular, and therefore it is the rectus abdominis muscle. What is this muscle? The shape of this muscle is telling me that it is made of several slips on the side of the chest. Therefore, these pieces of information should tell me that this is serratus anterior, and this muscle is at the back, and it is coming from down and disappears behind the muscles of the upper limb. This is latissimus dorsi, and nobody should miss what muscle is this.